Well, welcome back to the Happy Cynics, everybody. We're going to continue today our intergenerational analysis. We're going to focus on television today. Television's a pretty good window into cultural changes that have happened in the past 60 years. So let's just kind of delve right into this. I mean, I didn't necessarily I jotted down, I mean, there's a lot of TV shows that were popular, but I don't know that they're necessarily culturally significant, except if you wanted to analyze it to the level of what do people find funny, but I wasn't really going for that.
Yeah, I think as like with the rest of these episodes, we've had to focus on what are the shows that really signify like cultural changes in media.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm actually going to start off with what may be a surprise to you. I'm going to say the Beverly Hillbillies. And the reason I say that is because there were actually, was it Denning, the guy who was the creator of Beverly Hillbillies? Well, he ended up getting two other shows then, Petticoat Junction, Green Acres.
See, I know Green Acres better than I know Beverly Hillbillies.
Yes. Those shows were carried through most of the 60s, but there was this kind of nostalgia. So this is kind of the thing with, and some of this kind of goes a little before the British invasion of rock music from the Beatles, and then the other British groups, but then also the Vietnam War protests, civil rights protests. That stuff didn't really fully take off until the last half of the 60s, especially like 67, I think, is where a lot of stuff really started picking up steam. But there was this certain, I think, nostalgia. And this is why I think it's kind of culturally relevant, because there was kind of a growing polarity. The country was becoming more and more urbanized. Like, for example, I know even in, say, the Vatican II documents of the Catholic Church, Leo XIII talked about this in Rerum Novarum, but then it was brought back up. Well, actually, I don't think this is actually a Vatican II document, but John the 23rd's Mater et Magistra, Mother and Teacher, basically lamenting the loss of agrarian life and how a part of culture is kind of being wiped out by industrialization and urbanization. And there are certain values that are being lost. So this whole thing about family values and such, I think things were very quickly starting to shape in the direction that there's a growing difference between the kind of values held by people that live in cities versus the values by people that live out in the country and like still embrace the traditional life. So to me, like the Beverly Hillbillies kind of typifies this. Even the popularity of Westerns. There were a lot of Western shows that were still hanging on from the 50s, like Gunsmoke. But like the popularity of Bonanza, that was another TV show. These were more than just kind of, I think, entertainment diversions. I think there was a certain nostalgia of during, say, the 60s and the unrest and such that was going on, how people were kind of longing for the simple days. And this kind of carries forward. I'll talk about this in the 70s as well, because this continues in the 70s. It doesn't really carry over into the 80s. But in the 60s and 70s, there's this kind of looking back to the way things used to be, back previously. And there's a certain kind of like longing for the past, and I wish we could go back to these simpler times when things were more innocent and such and such and such. And then you get the counter push little by little in the 70s, the late 60s, 70s. Black people are put more out front on television shows. And then you have the development of shows about black families, about inner city life. There's a kind of a growing divide between, say, some of the white folks who long for the good old days and those who have kind of moved on to more urban life, and also people of color who remember, well, it may have been good for you, but those days weren't good for us.
Interesting. So the two shows that I think most people from my generation know from this time period are the Andy Griffith Show.
Yes.
And the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Yes.
And both of, Andy Griffith Show, I think, is definitely like nostalgic.
Oh, absolutely.
For that small town agrarian lifestyle.
Right.
Whereas Dick Van Dyke is more like, New York City urban, but suburban, family sitcom stuff.
Yeah.
But both of those shows have episodes addressing race relations.
They do. They do.
Which I find really interesting.
Yes. Yeah. So, a lot of shows, they wanted, even if they were focusing on something a little more, in other words, they're not issue-driven shows. They're just, trying to have some fun and this and that and the other. They still wanted to kind of be a little socially conscious of what was going on in the broader society. But I think that's absolutely right. The Andy Griffith Show. And the thing I find interesting, and I kind of battled whether to put Andy Griffith Show down. I don't really know if this was intentional. I doubt that it was. But I kind of sense, even with the Andy Griffith Show, kind of undertones like rural life is so much better than big city life. And the reason I say that, it's kind of countered by pretty much everybody in Mayberry being a doofus except for Andy. Everybody else is kind of simple-minded. So that's kind of the counterbalance to this. But on the other side, like even from the very beginning, the state police come in there and they're escaped criminals. And, the state police captain is basically saying, why don't you focus on catching chicken thieves and stuff that you usually do around here? Well, it really is kind of a thing and they made episodes about, he was known as a sheriff who doesn't carry a gun. So, he didn't carry a gun. He didn't carry a weapon because you don't have to. You're out in these small towns. Everybody's a good, decent person. Everybody tries to be honest. And so, hey, if you have a difference, you work it out. There's even episodes where Barney's trying to punish people by the book. And Andy's like, the rules. Like, in other words, if we just live these simple lives, a small town life, we wouldn't even need all these laws and everything. So most of what's going on in the country is coming from all these city slicker folks that really have abandoned traditional values and have to basically live well-regulated lives because they don't know how to just be decent people. I mean, that to me is kind of like an undertone there.
Well, I think the show from the beginning had to sort of be like that because of the way the pilot was. The pilot is a spinoff of another TV show.
Yeah, Danny. Make room for Daddy. Over. Yes.
And Andy is the cop that pulls him over.
Right.
And then he wants to dispute the ticket and finds out that Andy's also the judge in the local court.
They did something like that in I Love Lucy, too.
But that's sort of a commentary on and these small town cops can sort of rig the system so there's no disputing.
Well, that's true, too. Yeah, that's true, too. So, but yeah, I think there is a certain nostalgia there. And I'm also going to throw one more show in. Just came right on at the end of the 60s, but I think carried this kind of impetus, was Hee Haw. The show Hee Haw, I don't know if you've ever seen that show.
I've never heard of it before.
It was co-hosted by Buck Owens and Roy Clark, who were both pretty notable country stars. It was all country music. All the music was country music, and it was all focused on, like living on the farm and, the South. And this was kind of like the beginning, like the forerunner of what would become like the Nashville Network. And in other words, it's still, can I say it this way? It's still the Confederacy kind of protecting its own culture as a subculture of American culture and keeping too much of the northern stuff from infiltrating the good old, I don't want to overplay this, but what I want to say is this was like, oh, we've got our own show now. Like, and they filmed this in Nashville. And so this was like a show for Southerners. But my family all watched it, and it was on Sunday nights. So once we started going to the evangelical church, you couldn't watch it anymore because we were at church Sunday nights. But before then, I remember watching it. But yeah, no.
I wonder if we should do an episode on how the South versus North dynamic has shaped American life.
Oh, absolutely. Because let's put it this way. I think the tension between the southern states and the northern states goes all the way back. That's why we have the Electoral College. And that's why those states are still, as far as I'm concerned, they're basically holding the rest of the country back, if I can say it that way. They are like trying to keep pulling things backward. So even like I think it's a telling thing. For example, whenever like abortion and such was put on a referendum, how even like people in Kansas and the Bible Belt were still voting for women to have some say in procedures, not the government kind of dictating what can and can't be done in kind of a really strict way. Mm-hmm. But these are still people with very like conservative Christian values. But in the American South, that is really where that is the most countercultural part of our country, and it always has been. So anyway, maybe we will do a Confederacy.
Yeah, and I would like to point out, like, I think some of the South propaganda has infected, especially Midwestern northern states.
Yeah.
As someone who lives in rural Indiana, because there's a lot of Confederate flags around here.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes. That doesn't surprise me. So the Confederacy has become a symbol of, going back to the way it used to be or whatever. And
yeah, that would be really interesting to talk about.
So let's think about that one. I wasn't really sure whether to include this or not. I think it was interesting, though, that like the Flintstones was the first television show that was actually designed for adults and shown in prime time, which that doesn't seem like a big deal now. But to me, this is kind of like it's a changing of the guard. Because if you go back and look at, I don't know if you've ever looked at old clips, like there's some YouTube clips of old TV shows from the 50s and 60s. Some people have put those up now on YouTube. Mm-hmm. A lot of the comedy, say like Milton Berle, Jack Benny, Abbott and Costello, like whether it's film, television, whatever, a lot of the comedy all the way up through the 1950s was still dominated by what was left of vaudeville. A lot of slapstick, corny one-liners. This is where I think that kind of gets replaced with, like, even, for example, they started doing cartoons of comic book characters. So it was like a way for people to kind of, again, return back to their youth and kind of forget what was going on in the world. And I know there's always been that sort of thing there, but it's kind of with the development of color, Technicolor and things like that, that is what starts making this stuff possible. And so I've got this traced all the way up through. So like in the late 80s is when, you've got like The Simpsons. Again, another prime time show that was really designed for adults, not kids. And of course, Adult Swim is another topic altogether. I mean,
that'll be a little bit of my generation's contribution.
Yeah. So anyway, I did have that in there. I think a couple other little benchmarks that I think are interesting. I don't think the shows themselves are really all that significant, but like some of the details or premises of the shows, okay? Like I Dream of Jeannie. I think I Dream of Jeannie is not significant for what the show was, but what the show was not allowed to be. All right. So first of all, she wasn't allowed showing her navel. That was too provocative. So she had to keep her navel covered all the time. It's just like Gilligan's Island. You've got 3 men straining. Okay, you got the married couple, and then you've got 3 men and 2 women who are all single, and yet they don't get physically or romantically involved with each other. Of course, it's a sitcom, but like it's not even real life. And it's just like I Dream of Jeannie. You got this single bachelor guy, and this is why later, like I remember when I was a teenager, we used to laugh at the reruns of, say, like I Dream of Jeannie and just say, Major Nelson, he must have been gay. Because, like, if you had your own Jeannie who looked like Barbara Eden, I mean, he's like trying to avoid her. Like, she's wanting to hug and kiss him. And it's like, and he's trying to stay away. It's like, okay, come on. Is this guy for real or what? Because it's like, they weren't married. Well, then they tried to marry him later in the series. And then, like, all the tension was lost. So they're trying to, like, create this tension without there being tension. And it's just so, like, dysfunctional. It was kind of funny at the time because we realized the limitations of what television was working under. Like I Love Lucy, they weren't allowed showing, like, they had to have twin beds.
Same in Dick Van Dyke.
Yeah. They weren't allowed. You weren't allowed showing couples. There had to be so many feet between the beds. They couldn't have the beds pushed up against each other either. But this is where, like, I've read, Lucille Ball really did try to push the envelope by basically whenever they would kiss, she would extend it longer than it was supposed to go. So instead of just giving him like a little 1-second kiss, she would linger it for 5 to 10, try to linger it to 5 to 10 seconds. And it was live television, so really wasn't anything they could do. Carol Burnett show, I think, was significant in the sense that she was the first woman who was given her own show, like an hour-long variety show. So this was kind of a significant step for women because there was still a patriarchy operating in Hollywood. And I've listened to interviews of her talking about that, how she was the first. There were women that had television shows later, but as far as I recall, she was the first woman to have her own show. And so I think that's kind of significant. The other show comes in right at the tail end of the 60s that I think kind of reflects the times, but the show itself didn't go that direction, although Robert Reed wanted it to, and that was The Brady Bunch. And that was part of Robert Reed's being disgruntled with The Brady Bunch because it was supposed to start out as like a show that was funny, like lighthearted, but they dealt with like real issues. The same thing happened with Good Times with John Amos leaving the show. They wanted to deal with, and they did deal with some topics, but there weren't that many shows that could, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but there weren't that many shows that could really handle it the way it was done on All in the Family, where they really did have serious discussions, but that was couched into a lot of like jokes and even the discussions like Archie getting things confused or, confusing one word for another or some of his ideas made it comedic, but yet there was still the serious discussion underneath coming from Mike and Gloria and the occasional comment from Edith or Lionel Jefferson or somebody else. Mm-hmm. So they were able to handle that by having this kind of role play. That didn't really come off in the Brady Bunch. Robert Reed, like from what I read, he got kind of disgruntled because after the show became popular, then it was just kind of all these like little kitschy plots, like, is Marcia going to be the captain of the cheerleading team and, that sort of thing. I've got the other two themes that I think, well, first is sci-fi. Star Trek was a major thing in television. And it's interesting, too, because I mentioned Lucille Ball, but it was Desilu Studios that actually, like, they got turned down, but then Desilu watched the pilot again and gave them the okay to go ahead and film another episode. And then they went ahead and aired it. And now, it's become one of the biggest franchises in entertainment history. But that was significant. just this week, Bill Maher had William Shatner on his show, because I think William Shatner, what I read, is 92, 93 now.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, and he still looks like he's still pretty healthy and getting, he looks like he's doing fine. But he was even asking, like, that was the first interracial kiss on the air between Captain Kirk and Uhura. But even then, see, like with the censorship, it had to be closed mouth. They weren't allowed to have their lips parted. And so they just kind of like pressed their lips against each other and then kind of turned away. And it was done under the guise that they were being controlled by these other dudes that were doing like a Roman Colosseum type thing with mind control. Right. So it's like they got away with it because we got an interracial kiss, but the two people that did the kiss really didn't want to kiss each other. They were forced to by these sadistic aliens. So it's just interesting having grown up in that era, remembering how all this stuff was perceived. But looking back, it's really interesting. The only other thing I have with the 60s is there were shows that did delve into political comedy and get more directly into politics, politicians, and current events. So I would say probably the biggest impact was maybe not in the 60s, but he got his start in the 60s, and that was The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, The Tonight Show was there before with Jack Parr. I think that goes back into maybe the late 50s, I can't remember how far back that goes. Steve Allen, I think, was also the first host of The Tonight Show, and then Jack Parr, and then Johnny Carson. Well, Johnny Carson came from Nebraska, so he understood Middle America, but then he, became a California guy, and it's really interesting how he would do his monologue on, and he would, crack jokes at both sides of the political spectrum. But back in those days, people weren't really protective about parties and stuff like that. It was
right.
It was more just basic decency and morals and things like that. But there were more political shows. Like Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, starting in the late 70s, going into the late 60s, early 70s. That was a pretty significant show. It was a lot of slapstick, but they made a lot of cracks about politics and politicians and what was going on in the world. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, I think, was also pretty significant. They ended up getting canceled because they were too outspoken about some things. It's funny though, because I remember, and I didn't even put this on my list, but the show In Living Color, with the Wayans,
mm-hmm.
They actually did like a spoof of the Smothers Brothers. I don't know if you ever seen that sketch.
I haven't seen that sketch, but I do know In Living Color.
Okay. So they did this sketch, and it was a TV show called Black Like Me. And so they had David Alan Grier as like one of these, like, going back to Africa, going back to your root stuff with one of these like little mm-hmm. Jim Brown caps and stuff, coming on there and he's saying, what it is. And, talking about, the man drug me out of my crib buck naked and all this other kind of stuff. And they call them, they're kind of like acting like a couple. They call themselves Tom and Tom, the brothers. And they're like, you have to watch it. But they're kind of spoofing. But the Smothers Brothers actually did do a lot of political jokes. It was interesting. They ended up getting canceled because of that. I can't remember if it was stuff they said about Nixon on the air or Kissinger. I can't remember exactly what it was, but they end up getting canceled in the middle of one of their seasons, like the third or fourth season, if I'm remembering correctly. But I remember watching them as a kid. But that was another political show.
Very different, like thinking around that time that you could be canceled for making a joke about a president or
absolutely
important political figure.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, and it wasn't even always like the audience. Now, okay, so one thing was, okay, they didn't have the technology to really measure how the audience was impacted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so like now, they know how many sets are tuned in to watch a game. So just like they said, this NCAA women's final was the most watched basketball game ever. Okay,
right.
Well, they can track that digitally. They know how many people are tuned in. But back in the day, they couldn't tell that. I mean, the Nielsen ratings, if you were chosen to participate in the Nielsen ratings back in the day, you were sent like a packet in the mail and you had to like fill out a form for like a whole week of who was watching what shows from what time to what time. You had to draw like little graphs.
Very accurate data reporting.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it was all self-reporting stuff. So censors were actually extra cautious because if you waited to find out from the public, you may end up losing a lot of sales. It may take you a couple weeks to actually find out that a lot of people were ticked off and you're going to end up losing 30% of your audience within a month or whatever. And so they were, sometimes the sponsors were that way because people would get upset about what they heard on a show. And so they would say, okay, well, they're sponsoring this. I'm not going to buy their products anymore. And people were more apt
We've
to
seen
do that
play out in the modern period too, with advertisers leaving certain platforms.
Yeah. Well, the power of the dollar is probably the biggest power the average citizen
Well, mass
has.
media has always survived off of sponsorship money. It's advertising.
Right. So anyway, that's kind of my overview of the 60s. Is there anything else that you remember hearing about or whatever that maybe I should need to touch on?
Well, so as far as like media awareness in my generation of the 60s, another on the sci-fi track is we've received Doctor Who, which was an exclusive BBC air back in the 60s.
Yes.
Now, most people haven't gone back and watched the 60s Doctor Who, but Doctor Who is a huge show with my generation.
Yes. There was also like other, that was another thing in the 60s. There were like the Avengers made its way to American television.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The Man from U.N.C.L.E., The Saint. I forgot one really important. I think a landmark in 60s television was Sesame Street.
Oh, yeah.
That was really kind of...
I didn't realize that started in the 60s.
Oh, yeah. I grew up on Sesame Street. It like started when I was a couple years old, and I watched it every day. That and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Yeah, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, I was going to say, is the other one that my generation adores.
And the Electric Company was another one. That had Rita Moreno on it. Trying to think who else. Was it Morgan Freeman was on Electric Company? Or was he on Sesame Street? He was on one of them.
I don't know the Electric Company.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a pretty good show, too. They had some other ones that didn't last as long. Hodgepodge Lodge, I didn't go for that one too much. Or New Zoo Review, that was another one. But anyway, Sesame Street, and it wasn't just like teaching us numbers and letters, but there was all this kind of intercultural exposure that went on. Okay. And so, and this is the beginning of like children's programming specifically for children. Now, some would say, well, that was one of the downfalls because people just started setting their kids in front of the television instead of doing things with them.
Sure, yeah.
That did happen sometimes, but a lot of that was, I think it was pretty good programming. And so anyway.
Well, Sesame Street is interesting because of it's such a unique setting for a children's program, because it's essentially set in an inner city neighborhood.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
With characters named different names that are common to different ethnicities intermingling. Like there's a little bit of like sort of hidden messaging about diversity and the inner city in there.
Yeah. 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 And the subtle thing is that they do a lot of this with puppets.
Right.
More so than just bringing a bunch of human beings in there. I mean, they did have their occasional guests and such, and they had their regular staff and actors and actresses. But yeah, a lot of it being done with puppets. So you could really do a lot more that way. And so you could talk about things like diversity and things like that, where, well, you're not really talking about human beings, but you could see how it could apply to human beings.
Right. Well, and Mr. Rogers is famous for being very explicit about talking about diversity and inclusion. And
yeah, and you know, I honestly, even as a kid, I love Mr. Rogers, but I even I don't know, I guess he was married. I know he's a Presbyterian minister from Pittsburgh. And that's where it was filmed and everything. Oh, did I ever tell you? I actually had a whole collection of Mr. Rogers records unopened, and I sold them at a yard sale when I was a teenager, and my mom could have strangled me.
Yeah, those would be worth a lot of money right now.
I know. See, the place, I made 2 albums when I was a kid because I sang in churches all over. Kind of regionally. And so the place that I made those 2 albums was the same place Mr. Rogers recorded his albums. And when I made, when I made my album, my first album when I was 5 years old, the guy who owned the studio gave me a whole collection of Mr. Rogers albums, all unopened.
Interesting.
I had the whole set. And, my mom begged me, don't sell them. She didn't want to tell me not to because I was a teenager and they were mine. I'm like, I don't even think people even listen to this stuff anymore.
I wonder if that's the same studio that Johnny Costa recorded the piano intro for Mr. Rogers in.
I don't know.
So that's a fun fact about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is that Johnny Costa plays that theme song live on every recording.
Oh, wow.
So it's a different theme song every single episode.
I think
because he's improv jazz piano. So
I think it was actually called Glenn Campbell Studios, but it wasn't the Glenn Campbell guitar player. Glenn Campbell, not the Wrecking Crew Glenn Campbell, but
right.
But nevertheless, another guy. But anyway, yeah. So Sesame Street, I think that was pretty significant. So let's move on to the 70s. Okay.
Yeah.
So the 70s kind of opens up with The Odd Couple. Now, here's the thing. In the 70s, they're trying to bring up issues indirectly, just like with the premise of the show. So you've got 2 guys that are both divorced. So, and they're both dating women. So, they're heterosexual, but their relationship kind of takes that of a couple, like a married couple. And so, and this was based on the Broadway show. And they actually, I think, did a movie. So there was a Broadway show and a movie and then the TV series. But it kind of had this overtone. In other words, it wasn't about 2 gay men, but it kind of gave everybody kind of a little picture as to what a gay relationship could maybe look like. In terms of how 2 men relate to one another. One guy's always cleaning up, the other guy's creating a mess, and it just looks like typical gender role type stuff. Mm-hmm. You understand what I'm saying? So
right,
that was kind of the impact of it by making the one guy kind of sloppy and the other guy was a neat freak. So they're putting him in these kind of roles, and then it kind of takes on some of those dynamics. the big one, of course, I think, is All in the Family, and that's pretty well known. So I don't need to necessarily run this one in the ground. But, they handled so many different issues on that show. I mean, even issues you wouldn't even think about. Like, I know, like, they kind of overplayed it, so it wouldn't be maybe too cutting. That was another kind of technique they used. They would kind of exaggerate it a bit, so it wasn't quite as uncomfortable. So like Edith going through menopause. Okay. I don't know if you ever seen that episode or not.
I haven't seen any episodes of All in the Family.
Oh my, you have to watch those. I mean, there was always episodes about, his views on blacks and Puerto Ricans, and and there's even one where they're getting involved in politics, and Archie's like, you got to have the right man for the right job. Feldman's running for treasurer. Well, good, because they know how to handle money, Jewish people. And of course, there's another episode where Archie needs a lawyer, so he wants a Jewish lawyer. And there's all these kind of prejudices, but then they were also dealing with like sexuality, where Mike and Gloria have this friend who's very effeminate, and Roger is sure that he's homosexual, but he's not the one who's homosexual. It's this guy that he was friends with that had played in the NFL, and he didn't want to accept that this guy was gay. And so there's all different kinds of issues that come up in that show. So it's just a landmark show, and
that's a pretty bold, nuanced take on that for the 70s.
Yes, it was. And so it's there, and its mark is that it, of course, it spun off a couple shows. So Maude was a spinoff of that, and then they took Bay Arthur, and her character was very feminist. And so there was like about divorce, remarriage, and then like typical feminist issues. Then you had the spinoff of that show was Good Times, because her housekeeper, Florida Evans, then they decided to do a show on her family, and those are the Evans family. And then once Jimmy Walker became famous with his dynamite stuff, that was kind of like the same thing with Happy Days. It just became like the Fonzie show. But nevertheless, you had the Jeffersons was another spinoff of All in the Family. Okay. So we're starting to see little by little, okay, even black families. It just shows on black families, not shows about white people who happen to know a couple black people or have some black neighbors. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's a good shift. A big landmark thing in television in the 70s, I think, was the miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Mm-hmm. This is like LeVar Burton, the guy who was Geordie LaForge, but he played Kunta Kinte, who was, the ancestor of Alex Haley, who wrote the book Roots. And then, of course, they made it into this miniseries. But this was really kind of like an expose of what happened, like some of the kinds of things that happened during the slavery era in America.
Yeah. So LeVar Burton, really important guy for my generation of TV. He's the host of Reading Rainbow.
I also noted a couple of shows here in the 70s where I think there's still this reminiscing. Now, like the interest in the Westerns and rural setting stuff tends to kind of go away. But Happy Days is like the biggest impact one. Of course, that was based on American Graffiti movie, which was a look back at 50s life. And Happy Days did start that way. If you even look at the first, like the set, like they used canned laughter and stuff on the first season. And it looked like a 50s house, like small rooms with like a door, like a separate dining room from the living room. And then they knocked all that out and made it all open space when they went to a live audience. That way they can have an open set and just have it all there, like with a fold out window going into the kitchen area, so they could just have everybody, have it more spread out. But it started out like about Richie Cunningham and the stuff that he was going through in high school. So it was still kind of reminiscing about what life was like growing up in the 50s, going to high school in the 50s and that sort of thing. But then it, like I say, with the popularity of Fonzie, it just kind of became the Fonzie show after a while, which was fine.
Yeah. Well, it gave us the phrase "jump the shark."
Yeah, oh my goodness. Jumping a shark and still having his leather vest on. It's just it was so ridiculous.
Now, who's the actor who played the Fonzie?
Oh, you mean Henry Winkler? Yeah.
Henry Winkler. He's had sort of a comeback.
Yeah, he has.
The 2010s. Yeah. He's put out some really, really good shows.
Yeah, I like Henry Winkler. Yeah, he seems like a really good guy. Glad he's still around. I think all of those guys are still around. Ron Howard and
Ron Howard's put out some great. He's going to be important. He directed a TV show that is very formative for the 2000s.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm familiar with him. I think he directed the movie Backdraft, and there was a couple others he's done. But yeah.
Well, he did Apollo 13.
Oh, yeah. Ron Howard probably is one of the more significant people in TV history.
Started off on the Andy Griffith Show and has remained relevant since the 60s. So
yes. Yeah, absolutely. There was still a little bit of the reminiscing going on, I think, still back in the 70s. So I would cite shows like, I said Rural was out. Not necessarily. The Waltons, Little House on the Prairie. Those are the two that come to mind. Those were very popular shows. Again, there's this kind of looking backward to simpler times. What would life be like back there on the farm or whatever, or Walnut Grove. So anyway, there's that. The sci-fi thing, I think, kind of carried forward with the $6 Million Man. We thought that was the coolest thing when it came out. Steve Austin, astronaut, barely alive. We can rebuild him. We have the technology, so they gave world's first bionic man. He's like running 60 miles an hour and he's like lifting stuff with his mechanical arm and he's like looking.
Now, was RoboCop also the 70s?
That was 80s. Yeah, I forgot about that in the movie. I don't know if that's significant though, except just to trash Detroit.
Yeah.
Because all this terrible apocalyptic stuff tends to happen in Detroit.
Yep.
And so anyway, did you ever see I don't want to get off topic, but you ever I guess you've seen RoboCop all the way through.
I've never seen it, but
really?
The reason I'm aware of RoboCop is because RoboCop has had a revival in the last few years.
Well, you got to watch it towards the end. So when they're trying to he's finally hunting these guys down, one guy gets covered in all this toxic waste, and then it's his skin and tissues all kind of like hanging off of him, and then he gets hit by a van by this other guy, and he just kind of like explodes. It's the most disgusting thing. But anyway, so $6 Million Man, and of course they followed that up with the Bionic Woman, but that's kind of like the sci-fi. So now it's more like we're still kind of thinking about technology and where it can take us. So there's still some of that going on. I'm still going to carry that into the 80s. I think that's still a little bit there. It's not as big of a thing, but that's because by this point you had the Star Wars film franchise, and then they were making Star Trek movies. So it really wasn't until what was Star Trek Next Generation? Late 80s, early 90s?
I think that's early 90s.
Yeah. So that's kind of where it starts to resurface. And then you have, Babylon 5 and all these other, just like we end up with all these Law and Order TV shows and CSI, got to have, CSI Miami Beach or whatever, it's got to be.
Yeah, Miami Vice.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's like they got to have CSI in every city in America, so Tuscaloosa, Alabama. So anyway, the only other one I really put down here for the 70s was Saturday Night Live, because in addition to the Tonight Show, Saturday Night Live, they didn't deal with political stuff all the time, but they would tend to get political by bringing in guests who would push the envelope, and then they could say, "Oh, we didn't do it." So, like, they had, I can't remember if this may have been early '80s, but Sinead O'Connor, it just passed away here within the last couple months. She went on the Tonight Show and then burned a picture, like on live television. She burned a picture of John Paul II on TV.
That's inflammatory, literally.
It was. It turned out she was just blowing smoke. No, but that really offended a lot of people. And, but, I don't think they knew she was going to do that, but they kind of had an inkling she would do something. So anyway, I can't remember what that was to protest. That may have been after he did the document about what was it? Dignitatis Mulieris on dignity of women or something like that. And it was saying about how women have this great job of raising kids and stuff. Yeah. And like, okay, that wasn't what the Catholic feminists were looking for, but that's what they got. So Saturday Night Live became a vehicle for people to get on there and make their pitch. But sometimes it really wasn't the regular cast members that were doing this. That was a clever format. You could bring your guest in, and if your guest wanted to push the envelope, then they could just say, hey, okay, if you do, then we're not going to be able to have you back on. But then they couldn't. They would just kind of wash their hands of responsibility. And that was the point of it being live, because that way they couldn't be expected to edit it out.
Right. So,
anyway, it was a very clever thing. And, and that's why we still, even within the last couple decades, you've had people doing impersonations of presidents and everything going all the way back to Clinton. I think they were even impersonating Reagan. But I'll tell you what, now some of this, if you want to talk about really political, have you ever watched the YouTube clips of whenever Norm Macdonald did the weekend news updates on Saturday Night Live?
So... that's been getting some public discourse recently because of O.J. Simpson's death.
I mean, that whole collage. I mean, man, some of that stuff he said, it's surprising he wasn't fired before he was. He's like, Johnny Cochran.
Well, a lot of the discourse recently has been that they wish Norm Macdonald was still around.
Yeah.
So that he could have witnessed the death of the killer of O.J.'s wife.
Oh, yeah. I remember he's like, OJ found that, publishing a book didn't make as much money, or like, I forget what he said. It hasn't worked out well for him. And Johnny Cochran says we need to get this trial over so OJ can get back to doing what he does best, killing people. But it's like, I'm surprised that he got away with that stuff. But
the joke everyone's telling right now, I don't know if I could even include this in the podcast. That'll be up to you. I'll let you make this editing decision.
All right.
The joke everyone's telling right now is OJ can finally rest in peace knowing his wife's killer's finally dead.
Oh. Well, that's not as inflammatory as you would think.
It's just dark.
It is dark. Oh, my golly. Gee whiz. Yeah. It was... It was, I mean, after they announced the verdict, Norm Macdonald got on the Weekend Update, said, well, it's official. Murder is now legal in California. Yeah, gee whiz. I mean, that's pretty bold. I don't think they'd get away with that today. That's what is kind of funny about it as well to me. Not funny, interesting. That we went from this strong censorship, okay, to basically in the 80s, like people were saying pretty much whatever was on their minds. Maybe All in the Family and shows like that kind of paved the way. I mean, even George Jefferson would say some stuff, kind of like he became the kind of black counterpart of Archie Bunker. Okay. Mm-hmm. But they did give him some redeeming qualities on the Jeffersons then. Same thing with like later they tried to, Carol Connor didn't want to play a heel forever, but then once they softened him up, it wasn't as funny. But you can only do that so long anyway, and people kind of grow weary of it. But
yeah,
it's funny how this has kind of come back now. And now, and maybe it's just we're more sensitive to people's feelings and such. But, you know, it's like the pendulum has kind of swung back toward censorship again, because, like, we don't want to offend people. So anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting, the dynamic of censorship from like the 60s, 70s era to today, because now censorship isn't like a government, congressional hearing of all these, publishers that are going to lay out all these ground rules for what you need to do to get your thing published.
Right.
Now it's censorship by basically mob violence.
Right.
Now, from the 70s, the one show that I think my generation has a decent awareness of, I've seen most episodes of it, is MASH.
Oh, I forgot about MASH. But that is, that is significant. Of course, that was based on the movie MASH.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But they did turn that into, I don't want to say turn it into, but I've seen where they interviewed cast members and even the producers of the show. They started out and it was just kind of like, wartime hijinks, the first couple seasons. But then after Henry, McLean Stevenson wanted to leave the show because NBC...
And they killed off his character.
They killed off his character because, NBC offered McLean Stevenson his own TV show. Mm-hmm. And it was called Hello, Larry. I don't know. You wouldn't know that one, I guess.
No idea. Yeah.
He basically was playing it was kind of like an earlier version of Frasier, where he was.
Oh, okay.
He was like a psychiatrist who had a call-in radio show, and so they were trying to do that. The show never. I don't think it lasted more than a season, but they basically said if you leave, you're not coming back. So they killed off his character. But when they brought, Harry Morgan in. They started focusing, and then of course, the guy who played Trapper, Wayne Rogers, he left the show too. And so whenever BJ Honeycutt came in, they started focusing more and more on like the horrors of war and things like that, like the episodes of like soldiers getting local girls pregnant and then abandoning them and their kids and going back to the States. And then like Hawkeye having PTSD. I don't know if you remember, there's that episode at the very end where this woman ends up smothering her baby to keep all of them from being killed.
I do. Yeah.
It's now they don't show it. I mean, but he's like he's remembering it to the psychiatrist, Sidney Friedman. That was culturally significant. A show that was kind of lighthearted, but also pushed some of these issues in a lighthearted way was Three's Company. And that was John Ritter's first big show. And just the fact of, two women and a man cohabitating, that was a no-no. I remember even the pastor at church, basically saying Christians don't watch this kind of stuff. And then here's the thing. They even then brought up homosexuality by making it that the landlord only let him stay because he said that he was gay. And because he was gay, then he could live with the two women. So he's trying to act gay, but, date women behind the landlord's back. And so anyway, it was an interesting show. And then it had its own drama, but it really wasn't like some of these shows, it wasn't so much that they were choosing plot lines for their episodes. It was just like the general premise of the show. Once people got over that, that's what was kind of funny about some of these shows. Once people got over like their apprehensions about the premise of the show, then they would often watch the show, enjoy the episodes, because the episodes really weren't predominantly about that anyway.
Yeah. That's sort of similar to like a New Girl in the modern period.
Oh, okay.
Where you have an attractive young lady who's recently been broken up with, move in with 3 single guys.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. I remember there was another show. It didn't last too long. But there was a show in the 80s. And each of these people ended up on other TV shows. Okay. So, I'm trying to remember the name of the girl, but it was a girl who had 2 dads. It was called My Two Dads. Basically, the premise of the show was her mother was a single mom. She dated both of these guys and never found out which one was actually the father.
Oh.
And so
that doesn't work in the modern period. We have the technology.
Yes. We have the technology. At that point in time, the only thing you could do is just basic blood typing.
Yeah.
So like if she had O positive blood and one of the men had B positive, then he couldn't have been the father, kind of thing. That was the only thing they could really do.
What's that show in the more modern period? You're Not the Father. What's that show called?
Maury Povich?
It is Maury. It is what is the show name? It's just the Maury Show.
Yeah,
that's
the Maury Show.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, he had this like he would go on like he went on like these kicks where he would just do the same thing for like a year or so.
Yeah.
He did all these paternity tests, who's the real father and all this kind of stuff. He did that for a while. And then he did a whole series of like, kids that were struggling with drugs, and they'd take them in and let these inmates in prison like yell at them like drill sergeants. Yeah.
It's like trauma tourism.
Yeah. It's almost like a slightly more serious version of the Jerry Springer Show. And that is another one that we should probably mark as a significant development in TV history. Because this was like a guy who says, I don't care about standards of decency. I don't care, and it wasn't. So from what I've heard and read, it wasn't that like it was all scripted, but it was kind of like the people were encouraged to just kind of,
well, same with the Maury Show.
Yeah, kind of carry it forward. But, I mean, it's pretty bad when you have a TV show like Jerry Springer, where you already have a sound effect ready to go that's like ringing the bell at the beginning of a boxing or wrestling match. The people when they start fighting and they go ding, 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 ding. And then the security guys come in, wait till they're about ready to bloody each other's noses and then pull them apart.
Those shows are sort of like watching a car accident happen.
Oh my golly. It's like
I think this is morally reprehensible, but I can't look away from what's happening on the screen right now.
Yeah, it's like everybody, it's like going to the sideshow at the circus. It's like you don't want to see the freak show. You don't want to admit it's like a guilty pleasure, It
is the most guilty pleasure TV that exists.
Yeah, it's like I can't pass this up because you just got to see.
But
what
it's not even pleasure; it's just like
curiosity.
Guilty. Yeah.
It's not like you're just sitting there relishing it, but it's like, man, I can't believe there's actually people like this.
It's like it is like a freak show. You're right.
Yeah. So. I can't remember when Jerry Springer got started, if that was the 80s or early 90s.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, anyway, in the 80s, was there anything else in the 70s that we should?
No, I think it's really
touch on?
just MASH. I thought maybe like Hogan's Heroes, but that's the 60s.
Yeah.
The A-Team, that's the 80s.
Yeah.
As far as what my generation would know. So it's really just MASH.
So,
and, Happy Days and stuff like that.
So, all right. So explain to me, I would not have picked the A-Team. Why? How do you see the A-Team as culturally significant?
As far as, I don't think it's culturally significant, but I think people from my generation know the A-Team.
Okay. All right.
Like, it's entertaining enough that we like that show.
Yeah.
And we know Mr. T and, those characters.
Well, okay. So, if you listen to the theme song, it's like these guys are like, it's always like somebody who was wrongfully committed, convicted of a crime they didn't commit. And then they promptly escape from a maximum security. And it's like, okay, these guys are supposed to be on the run from the authorities, and they're just like out in the open, like walking down the street and everything. It's like, okay, this isn't real life.
It's very campy.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's meant to be. But I pity the fool.
Yep.
So anyway, all right. So here's my list for the 80s. I'll start with Family Ties. I think here was like, okay, the hippies coming of age. That's what this kind of show was about. Michael J. Fox played the teenager who loved Reagan and Reaganism. And he's portrayed as kind of like, because Reagan knows corporate America and how to be successful and all this stuff. That's the way it's kind of all portrayed in this kind of polarizing way. And so it's trying to say, are these people who are hippies, did they sell out to become yuppies, young urban professionals?
Yeah.
Are they too materialistic, or do they still have their values and all that sort of thing? So that was one thing here. Another one that I think just kind of reflects some of the culture is, or at least shaping the culture, The Cosby Show. Now, I know now it's probably never going to be seen again based on what we found out about Bill Cosby since then. But at the time, that show was about a black family who was successful. It wasn't like, some black family living on the corner and like even the Jeffersons. George Jefferson had money, but he was a dry cleaner. Okay. So he was a businessman, made money, but it wasn't like he was a brain surgeon or something. But you have Heathcliff. Okay. And he's even got a fancy, upper crust sounding name, Heathcliff Huxtable. Okay. And he is an obstetrician and his wife is a lawyer. So they're not just your run of the mill schmucks, making a blue collar living. These are white collar, well educated people. Okay. And so basically, and in fact, from what I remember and from what I read in the years after, the show had such an impact that there were actually black people protesting the show, saying it was too white. It was too, like, Cosby had sold out and he forgot his black Philadelphia roots and all this other kind of stuff. I remember he did Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids in the 70s. And there was always like and it was about his boyhood. Like the characters were based on people he knew growing up, because one of those is actually him, Bill, and then his younger brother, Russell. But there was always like some lesson you learned, but it was still about inner city life and all that kind of thing. But this was a family, they weren't worried about like, are they going to go to the community college? It's like they're going to go to, let's say Howard University or someplace that was a little more prestigious, but still like historically black. Okay. He got such pushback that in the later seasons, he started bringing in like a bunch of like old black musicians, singers and jazz musicians and such. And like he ended up having like about 30 different aunts and uncles, like, so like all these people could be on there. And then he's playing like old records of Etta James and Billie Holiday and such. And because he wanted to convince black people that, no, I haven't sold out. I'm just trying to say that we've got potential to do everything that everybody else is doing and blah, 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 blah. And so I think that was a culturally significant show for that reason. Anytime you stir the pot enough to where you're actually getting kickback from even some of the people that you think you're trying to help, you're ruffling feathers. You're at least doing something. So that was an interesting show, and it was also like even I remember even one of the early episodes. So it wasn't as though like in other words, becoming successful had disconnected him from his values, because his son, like, I forget what it was, Theo, if he had lied to him or whatever. And he said, son, he says, I brought you into this world and I can take you out again. So it's like, like, in other words, he's letting the audience know I still discipline my kids and I know my values and things like that. That was kind of the message he wanted to come out of the show. There was a couple things with Lisa Bonet when she got into early adulthood. They had to kind of write her out of the show for a while because she was kind of doing her own thing. They gave her own show, It's a Different World, by sending her off to college. But some of that, I think, was because she was like getting involved in stuff in her personal life that they thought might reflect negatively on the show. So they kind of took her off the show and moved her into that other show for a while. But anyway.
Yeah, interesting. Shame they didn't do that to Bill.
Well, they didn't. I don't think they knew at the time. It's just, yeah. And of course, that was still in the days where let's say, there were women who were afraid to speak up. I don't think all women were afraid to speak up, but Bill Cosby wasn't your average guy at this point. Like, Bill Cosby got his first TV show back in the late 60s. I think other things that kind of reflect the culture, I don't know if they impacted it. So the Golden Girls, and it was more than just old ladies, who could be funny.
Right.
Older ladies that could be funny, but they really did focus on like senior issues, because now this was at the time that the baby boomers were starting to age. And like a lot of them are like, okay, well, Social Security was designed to only last for like 10 years after you retire. And now a lot of us are living 20 plus years after we retire, and there was all these stories about older people. They couldn't afford to eat regular food, so they were eating dog food and stuff like that. There was all these kind of like stories about, and they had to choose between eating and getting their medications. And so this was all being thrown around, and they also threw some other issues in there here and there as well. Cagney and Lacey, I don't think was super significant, but here you had two women who were partners, police officers. Typically, they would have a man and a woman. This is at least interesting to me because it was kind of implied up to this point that women can be police officers as long as they're partnered with men who are stronger and faster. So she can kind of help the man. Now they had just two women working on their own and showing them to be competent and such. So this is striking another blow for women's equality is kind of what it's trying to do. And as it turns out, Tyne Daly, of course, I think Sharon Gless, the one who played Christine Cagney, I think she in life was, I think she might have been lesbian. I'm not sure, but I think so. But there was also those kind of overtones too. Like the one character was married. Okay. The Tyne Daly, she was married on the show. But they had just kind of close friendship. I don't think it really had any kind of, and it didn't have any kind of romantic or anything, overtones or anything like that. But I think it was just really trying to say women can do the job as well as men, was the main thing. And so that was an interesting dynamic. And then there was also a movement towards trying to kind of peel back some of the, like the sterilization of drama shows that had happened in previous generations. So I'm thinking of Hill Street Blues. Hill Street Blues was a popular show, and then NYPD Blue later was even more so. I think the producer was Stephen Baccio or something like that. I remember there was a lot of controversy over this, but these shows kind of pride themselves as being a little more realistic about what really goes on, as opposed to this kind of dramatized stuff. So anyway, Hill Street Blues, it was supposed to kind of get more into like, and then later we end up with reality shows, like Cops, America's Most Wanted, and some of this stuff. But there's that. So go ahead.
One of the things that's going to come up for my generation of TV is the phrase "copaganda."
Okay.
Have you heard that before?
No. Go ahead.
It's this phenomenon in TV shows where like cops are like everywhere in TV for some reason. And copaganda is cop shows that are designed to make the police look good. Like the police are always on the right side of the issues. The police always get their man, that sort of TV show is really prominent even up to today, and is going to come up with a sitcom that's going to be important for my generation.
All right.
But it goes all the way back to the Andy Griffith Show.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I will say, I think some of that stuff was tackled in Law and Order, the original series. They did have some shows where, like there was cops that were on the take or engaged in brutality, and others look the other way, the blue wall of silence and all that sort of thing. And then the homicide detectives basically had like some of the, the other cops kind of got angry at them because they reported this to the DA and stuff.
Right.
So anyway, but that's interesting.
Yeah, there's also part of propaganda, and I think Law and Order does this, is portray defense attorneys as like the villain.
Oh, yeah. Like defense attorneys are always like really sleazy and have no morals, and it's just about winning. Yeah. We know he's guilty as sin, but we're just gonna use every trick in the book to try to help him get away with it.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I mean, you did know that it was the OJ trial is how the name Kardashian became known. I don't know whether the Kardashians, the Kardashians' father was one of OJ's attorneys.
I did know that. Yeah.
Okay. And so, and then she became even more famous after she, I think his name was Robert Kardashian. She had divorced him and then remarried and married Bruce Jenner, who became Caitlyn Jenner.
Right.
So the Kardashian sisters, they didn't kind of start.
They didn't kind of media empire.
Yeah, they didn't kind of start from the ground up. They had some name recognition to start with.
Yeah.
Although they do have their own assets, if you want to say it that way, I guess. Anyway. So, back to my list. I think there was a little bit there still continues to be some sci-fi stuff, that lingers in television. So just little things. Knight Rider, like a completely self-governed car, but computerized and everything.
KITT.
by the way, and then which is one of my other shows, the nostalgic show. So I'll come back to this. Quantum Leap, I think, was another one that was pretty interesting. That was a way of both thinking about time travel, but then also a way of going back and looking at past situations,
right,
and revisiting them. And they kind of tried to go back and look and give people like an inside look of what things were like in different eras. Were they like to some of this, it was a certain reminiscing, but some of it was like bursting the bubbles of like, oh, everything was just like, lollipops and roses back there.
That's sort of a cult classic TV show in my generation.
Oh, really?
Like lots of people love Quantum Leap.
Oh, did not know that. But yeah. So I like that show. I'd already mentioned The Simpsons. Simpsons kind of again, but this is another. I think The Simpsons. Their thing was doing all these parodies, but because it's a cartoon, you could make it a little more poignant and
push the envelope
funny.
A little bit.
Yes. Because it doesn't, it seems pretend, but then so it's less confrontational.
Hey, Happy Cynics. Just coming in here at the halfway mark of this episode to let you know that the next half will be published next week because we ended up recording for quite a long time. If you've enjoyed this episode, or if you haven't, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can reach out to us at thehappycynics@gmail.com with any questions or episode suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. And if the world doesn't end, we'll see you next week.